Gregory Wrightstone is a geologist and executive director of the CO2 Coalition. He's been an expert reviewer for the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he's the best-selling author of a number of books, including Inconvenient Facts and also Very Convenient Warming. He disputes the scientific consensus on climate change, and he criticizes what he calls climate alarmism. So, Gregory Wrightstone, thank you ever so much for joining me today.
Oh, very good. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Can we start with something basic? Can you tell us something about yourself in terms of how did you get interested in global warming? I know you're a geologist, but how did you get interested in global warming? And why did you write this book and the previous book?
As a geologist, I knew that some of what we were being told about man-made climate change and climate that's being presented was just false. And that was mainly ocean acidification. I knew as a geologist that our oceans have never acidified, even when carbon dioxide levels were at 15 and 20 times as high as they are today. The oceans didn't acidify, and they're not going to acidify now. So I knew that was incorrect. I suspected that our other things that were being told about climate change was just wrong. And there was so much competing information on, well, this is happening. No, it's not. You're wrong. And so I decided to take a deep dive and not trust anybody initially. Nullus in verba, we talked about. And I said, what I want to do, I'm going to look at these various claims of crisis, and I'll look at the very base. I'm not going to say I'll look at the very base data, that's going to drive the other papers that are being written. And I just found out that time after time, my own personal search for the truth showed that the consensus opinion, if you will, was just wrong. And frankly, it angered me. And that's what led to the writing of my first book. I said, this needs to be exposed. And that was Inconvenient Facts, was my initial book. It's been very successful. In fact, I've just authorized and paid for the 10th printing of that book. It's been very, very popular. And in that book, we captured that there is, in fact, no climate crisis. And in my second book, I've gone farther, not just me, but my fellow scientists and experts at the CO2 Coalition. We find that not only is there not a climate crisis, but the combination of modest warming and more CO2 are, by every metric, providing huge benefits to Earth's ecosystems and, by extension, to humanity, the human conditions thriving and benefiting from modest warming and more CO2. And it flies in face. You talked about a consensus opinion. I'll remind you the Michael Crichton, noted author, creator of quite a few books that were then turned into movies. Michael Crichton famously said, if it's consensus, it's not science. If it's science, it's not consensus. And the great Michael Feynman said, I'd rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. And that's what we have today. We have, the answer is man's emissions of CO2 are leading to unprecedented and unnatural warming, not seen on the scale of thousands of years. And that's really what we need to talk about is, where do they get it wrong?
Yeah. Okay. I like the quotations that you give, and in fact, I noticed that at the back of this particular book, The Very Convenient Woman, there are a number of those quotations, which I found all of them very thought-provoking and very apposite to the issues at hand. Can we start at the very beginning and take this from a very basic point of view and level? So I just want to try to click off some basic facts and see where the agreement is with consensus and where it starts to diverge with consensus. Mm-hmm. Come with me on this little journey of, first of all, is the Earth really warming or not? What's the evidence for that?
It is warming.
It is warming. Okay.
There's no dispute, but
Okay.
that's not the question. That's not the key.
Well, I've got
The
another
question
question
is,
after that.
okay,
All
all
right.
right.
Next one is CO2 the main cause of the warming?
CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It has a warming effect on the atmosphere, thankfully, but it's a very trace greenhouse gas. So in our opinion at the CO2 Coalition, does CO2 have a warming effect on the atmosphere? Sure, yes it does, but it's very minor and probably overwhelmed by the natural forces that have been driving temperatures up and down since the dawn of time.
Like, yeah, creating ice ages and then disappearing and those kind of things, and variations and stuff. Okay, next question is the level of CO2 increasing or not?
Oh, of course. Sure
It
it is.
is.
We've increased from at the end of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we were at about 280 or 285 parts per million. We're at 420 today. That's a 50% increase in CO2. But rather than saying that it's leading to catastrophic consequences, what we find is that actually that more CO2 is hugely beneficial to Earth's ecosystems and to us.
If the CO2 level dropped below 280, what would happen?
Well, it could drop. Obviously, plants love and thrive at higher CO2 levels. If you think back to when you first learned about photosynthesis,
Yeah.
what do plants need? They need water, sunlight, and CO2. And the more CO2, the better. We're actually still have CO2 levels at near historically low levels. We're actually CO2 impoverished. We don't have too much CO2. We don't have enough. And so it really, the lower you get, 280, 250, 200, at the end of the last ice advance, we were at about 182 parts per million, which is dangerously low. And why is it dangerous? If it ever fell to 150 parts per million, plant life could not survive. And that, I don't need to remind you, would be a true climate catastrophe.
That would be a catastrophe. What surprises me when talking to other people is that very few people understand how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. I think it was in Congress, someone asked some of the witnesses how much CO2 they thought was in the atmosphere, and some said 5%, 10%, 20% of CO was CO2, when in actual fact it's 0.4% or something like that.
0.04.
0.04.
400.
Yes. Okay. So,
400s.
yeah, it's a very small amount in comparison. My next question on CO2 is: if CO2 is increasing, as you said it is that due to man-made effects, or is it due to other factors? Or
It's
don't we know?
near, oh, we do know. And in fact, we're just finishing up a paper about what is the source of the CO2 in the last 80 years. It was about 80 years ago at the end of the World War II, the great post-World War II economic boom, that we started adding significant amounts of CO2 to the atmosphere. And in that last 80 years, we find we've looked at this to document that the CO2 in the atmosphere, yes, it is from man's emissions, mostly from the use and burning of fossil fuels, but also a small amount from cement manufacture. They are, and we can document that, and we're doing this in this paper 5 different ways. For example, we know pretty closely what our emissions of CO2 from industrial activities, what is that number? And we can document that pretty closely. And what's fascinating is what's showing up in the atmosphere. We know we're emitting X gigatons of CO2 every year. Well, what shows up in the atmosphere? Half of it. Well, what happens to the other half? It's being sequestered, sucked up by Earth's natural processes, and it's mainly a vegetation increase.
Yeah.
So what we see is this increasing CO2 is driving just an explosion of plant growth. It's called the greening of the Earth. We see it from the near polar regions to the equator. Every single ecological niche is benefiting. Not the deep Sahara Desert and not the Antarctic, because there's no plant life either place, but everything that has some plant life is benefiting from this increase in CO2. And so we should benefit that. We should embrace that And so, yes, our emissions, half of the emissions are being sequestered by increased vegetation, using that CO2 and turning it into bigger trees, more lush foliage, and agricultural products that we're consuming, thankfully.
One of the things which people are trying to do at the present time is to extract the CO2 from the atmosphere, sequestering it not in trees, but underground caverns or underground things. What do you make of that approach?
It's an incredibly unwise and economically costly thing to do. It's leading to detriments to the Earth's ecosystems. Thankfully, we're not doing it on a large scale yet, but there's talk about doing this. And if CO2 is not uh, the pollutant that they say it is, if it's actually, like we contend, and we can actually prove the huge benefits of more CO2, it's spending trillions of dollars uh, to solve a non-existent problem. And so this CO2 that they're doing, it is incredibly expensive. For example, we had a paper recently, we looked at coal-fired plants in the United States, electricity generating plants from coal, to put carbon capture and sequestration on and strip out the carbon dioxide coming out the stacks. It was going to require 24% of the energy that plant created. So understand, it's really expensive, and you lose 24% of the energy. So now you have to provide even more energy, electricity, to pay for the carbon capture. Not pay, but to actually do it. And it's not wind and solar, because those are intermittent energy sources that cannot be relied on. And just let me just finish up here real quickly. There are three things when we talk about electricity and electricity generation. There are three things that I look at and say that's a good electrical source. It should be reliable, abundant, and affordable. Those things: reliable, abundant, and affordable. Wind and solar are none of those. That can be achieved through natural gas, coal, and nuclear. Nuclear is not a problem, but if we want to generate huge amounts of electricity, we're likely 40 years from actually having enough, if we started today, to build enough nuclear reactors to power our entire system.
Hmm. Which would be one way to go, I think. But I think the Green lobby doesn't even like nuclear, which seems to be the cleanest of all the fuels in many ways. Coming back to CO2, I mean, I don't know if it's the same on your side of the Atlantic as it is on ours, but we have a massive drive in the UK and in Europe to go to what's called zero carbon. So everything has to become zero carbon. I think we're getting rid of motor cars, gasoline, and that, and have to all be electric cars, I should say, by 2030. That's our plan here, which seems ambitious to say the very least. Okay, but the aim is to reduce our carbon output, or carbon CO2 output, I suppose it must be, to zero by 2035 and 2050 as well. Even if we were to do that, would that have an effect on climate change as such, in your opinion, or not?
Would it have an effect? Yes, it would have an effect, but it's so incredibly small. If we look at the warming potential, and we've written papers on this, and Dr. William Happer and Dr. Richard Lindzen have just actually looked at that. What would be the aversion of warming by 2050 if we went to net zero? And it's on the scale of hundreds and thousands of a degree Fahrenheit of warming averted, which is less than we can even measure or detect. So if we went to net zero, again, the warming that would be averted is just incredibly small. And think about this too. They're telling us that temperatures should not rise above, or cannot, they could, but it's going to be dangerous. You know what's going to break, all hell's going to break loose if we ever get to 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit above the temperature of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Well, guess what? It's already warmed 1.2 degrees. So what they're saying is, if it warms another 0.3 of a degree centigrade, it's going to be just catastrophic. 0.3 of a degree centigrade. Well, you can't, if it changed 0.3 of a degree in your office that you're sitting at, you couldn't tell it. Your thermostat in your office is not triggered by 0.3 of a degree centigrade. And if you're that worried about it, I'm not sure exactly where you're located today in the Northern Hemisphere, mid-latitudes. If you're that worried about 0.3 of a degree of warming, move, well, it would be, I don't know what it is in kilometers, 19 miles further north, and your average temperature would decline. And not only that, it changes more than that between 11 a.m. and noon almost every single day. And that's what they're warning us about. When you look at it in that context, you shake your head. They're talking about leading the world's economies, driving us into brownouts and blackouts, all to save 0.3 of a degree centigrade of warming. No, thank you.
So to put it this way, then, the Earth is warming. It's warmed by 1.2 degrees so far. It might get up to 1.5, which is a small amount. And we're expending huge amounts of money, resources, finances to try to prevent climate change. We're determined to throw almost everything at it in terms of GDP and cash and whatever. Is that something which we could actually do if we put our mind to it? Is it possible that that human beings can prevent climate change, would you say, if they...
No, well, no, because most of this, if you look at, and if you look at thousands or millions of years, the climate and temperature has risen and fallen without any changes in, if you look back over the last 5,000, 6,000 years of human history, the temperatures changed significantly between 1.5 to 3 degrees centigrade between warming periods and colder periods. And the key here, Philip, is what happened in the past. If we look at human history and then look at climate history, we can learn a lot. And we find that going back to the very great beginning of the civilizations, the great civilizations that rose up, the Hittites, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Harappan Empire, and the Indus River Valley, all of these great first civilizations rose up during what was called the Minoan warm period, or the Bronze Age, and it was life was good, much warmer than it is today. They were growing a crop called millet in Scandinavia, which is a subtropical plant, and so during that time, food was bountiful, life was good, empires arose, and then it started getting cold, and it led to what was called the late Bronze Age collapse. And all of those great civilizations collapsed within a fairly short span of time. It's attributed to cooling, which led to crop failure, famine, pestilence, and mass depopulation. And we see that repeated time and time again over the last several thousand years. There were 3 great warming periods that were warmer than today. Each one of those warm periods was entirely hugely beneficial to humanity. The human condition thrived in those temperatures, much warmer than today. But again, when it started getting cold, it led to horrific consequences. So history tells us that we should welcome the warmth and fear the cold. Those whoever they might be, Greta Thunberg or John Kerry or Al Gore, they might call me a climate science denier. I would call them history deniers. They're denying what history shows us about the relationship between the human condition and temperature. And it's a really pretty clear story that warming and humanity, warming benefits humanity.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I understand that over in the States, you've got something which is called the $64,000 question. And here's the $64,000 question. in climate change, though, because you've just mentioned John Kerry and Al Gore, and even even Greta Thunberg as well. But why is it then? Why is it that the vast majority of people in the world, I'm told, looking at this, that the IPCC, I'm told that 101 Nobel laureates and the Dalai Lama say we're all facing a climate catastrophe. So how come that those people have got it wrong?
Well, they've never heard anything different, because contrary opinions have been, and for example, myself, my opinions and those of my colleagues at the CO2 Coalition were silenced. We disagree strongly, and we use science, facts, and data. We don't just disagree; we back our information up with scientific papers, research that disputes this. So I don't blame them if they've never heard it. What I find just talking to random people that are outside of my orbit, I talk to lots of people as I travel. People are thirsty for the information that we provide, the truth about climate change. And they have to silence me and my colleagues because we tell a compelling fact and science-based narrative contrary to the so-called consensus on man-made driven global warming.
Right. So does that have anything to say about the role of science today in terms of how honest it is or how open it is? What's your view on the honesty of the scientific society?
It's very disappointing. We have esteemed scholars, some of the top physicists in the world. They can't get their if their paper and their conclusion is contrary to the consensus, they don't get published in main journals. Yeah, can we get it published in a pay-per-play journal that they make their money like that? Yeah, you pay thousands of dollars, you can get it published. But the main journals don't touch anything that's contrary to the consensus opinion. And so they need to silence us. Our scientists, and again at the CO2 Coalition, we have nearly 200 of the top experts in the world, including John Clauser sits on our board. He's the 2022 Nobel laureate in physics. Will Happer, Dr. Happer, William Happer is our chair that I work with on a daily basis, and he's one of the most renowned physicists in the world that deal with radiative physics, the atmospheric physics, along with Dr. Richard Lindzen. We've done a lot of very good work, but it will not be published in the mainstream journals. So I'm very disappointed. And we can look. My next book that I'm almost finished with is a detailed review of Dr. Michael Mann, who created what was called the hockey stick.
Yeah.
And so the main thing there is with this, it's a reconstruction of temperatures using proxy data, and proxies we use where we don't have direct measurements from satellites or thermometers. And he looked back, and instead of a very warm medieval warm period 1,000 years ago, his recreation wiped out the Little Ice Age, which 500 years ago is probably the coldest period of the last 10,000 years. And it's his work that people are relying on that says that our temperature today is unusual and unprecedented. And so if you look at what he did, he fabricated data, he cherry-picked data, he actually made up data where it was missing, this is what it should be. A lot of very serious scientific flaws in his work, and some very brave people have exposed this.
The interesting thing is that yes, some people have gone up against Mr. Mann, and I know that there was a recent court case actually dealing with this kind of data with a guy called Mark Stein. Not sure if you heard of Mark Stein. He's a Canadian.
I sure do.
Broadcaster, and he lost the case against Michael Mann, and the jury seemed to side with him that his data was fine and everything was okay, and Mark Stein had libeled him or whatever it may be.
Yeah, Mark he was sued by Dr. Michael Mann for slander or libel. Mark Stein said that he was a fraud. His data was fraudulent. I'm not going to say that here because I don't want to be sued.
No, quite right.
But Mark Stein's famous quote that I love, it's typical Mark Stein. He's an acerbic commentator. He said, Dr. Mann's hockey stick recreation is a reconstruction of temperature using proxies with two problems: the reconstruction and the proxies. Other than that, you can take it to the bank. Now that's classic. And he's right. He used the proxy data he relied on were tree ring data from the Southwest United States on a particular study. The authors of the study stated right up front, do not use this tree ring data for temperature reconstructions. The temperature growth that we see in the 20th century is from increasing CO2. More carbon dioxide is fueling tree growth. And if you select the correct trees near the tree line, high latitude areas, high altitude areas, then those trees, you can use tree rings, because during warm periods, the trees grow faster. And when it's really cold, they don't grow much at all. And so you have to be very careful. But he did not follow that stipulation, and he used these incorrect data set to come up with his conclusion. And it drove that data set from that drove most of his subsequent work was driven, and the charts that were created of the hockey stick were generated based mainly on the bristlecone pine data of the Southwest United States.
They have been incredibly influential, but particularly the hockey sticker. I think it's influenced Al Gore and his book and all that. They've got massive publicity from that point of view.
Yeah,
well,
let's take a look at just real quick. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, we look at Al Gore when he did An Inconvenient Truth and was on a book tour and a movie. He shows a big chart, and he's up on a step ladder that he shows carbon dioxide and temperature moving in lockstep. And the CO2 is driving temperature over the last 800,000 years. Is the relationship over the last 800 years between CO2 and temperature? You're darn right there is, but it's just opposite of what Al Gore said. It's actually that as temperature changes, as it gets cold, the ocean sucks up more CO2. So it's actually temperatures driving CO2, not the other way around. And so we see that through time. During the interglacial warm periods like we're in right now, CO2 levels go up because of the ocean's outgas. When it gets cold, during the ice advances, oceans suck it up. But that's all changed in the last 80 years.
Why isn't that obvious to everyone? Because what you've just said basically says there are two curves. There's a CO2 curve and there's a temperature curve, and one follows the other. Well, you can see which one follows the other by seeing which one comes first and which one comes afterwards. Why isn't it that obvious to everyone?
Well, because that would crack their narrative. That would completely. They can't admit that. Although it's obvious and it's not admitted, they try and hide that. But again, temperature driving CO2, that's been true. That's very clearly the way it's been for millions of years. But all that has changed in the last 80 years, in that now, starting again in the post-World War II economic boom, we started liberating huge amounts of CO2 from primarily coal, but also oil and gas that were providing that. So that's changed. So the increase recently from CO2 is from our emissions. And so that I'll be attending a conference in Athens, Greece, in a few months, and we're going to be presenting the results of our work that we find.
You'll feel the temperature when you get there, I should think. It's quite hot in Athens.
Yeah, it probably is. But this is a conference being held. What's the source of the recent increase? And it's not nature, because nature actually is a giant sink, if you will. It's sucking huge amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and fueling plant growth.
Right. What I mean, the thing which puzzles me completely, you mentioned that they don't want this data to come out. They don't want to see that carbon dioxide follows temperature and not the other way around. But what I'm really having difficulty in understanding here, or getting to the bottom of, is what is the motivation to hide data? What is the motivation to pursue the climate alarmist narrative? Where does the motivation for that come from? Why isn't there a dispassionate approach to science? Let's just see what the data is and then we'll go with that. Where's the
Yeah, that's,
motivation here?
yeah, basically, I think you're asking, why are they lying to us?
Yeah,
And
why?
I, you know what, as a science, I don't know. You are just, every single one of your students and you are just as qualified as I am to say why they're doing it. Is it control? Is it funding? Is it money? Is it
Is there a
that they want
madness
to?
of crowds effect that takes place here?
There is. And so my job as a scientist, I can't see inside men's and women's souls to see what their motivation is. But what I can do as a scientist, and what we do at the CO2 Coalition, is say, okay, this is what you're being told, and here are the facts that dispute what you're being told. So as a scientist, it's our job to get to dig and give the truth and show what the source of our data is, and why they're doing it. I've heard all kinds of, they want to destroy Western civilization, they want to destroy capitalism, they want to, but the underlying theme for all of this is a greater control of our lives. They want to control what vehicle you buy, how you heat your home, how much water is used in the toilet or comes out of your shower head. Virtually every single aspect of our
And
lives,
even what you eat.
and what you eat. I just got back from the Netherlands. I spent 8 days there. My recent book was translated into Dutch. I was on an 8-day tour of the Netherlands. And actually, before we go there, I
Oh,
was there for 8 days. All I heard from the American news was this terrible heat wave in Europe. Well, I was in Europe. Had to wear a winter coat in the Netherlands for 8 days. It was cold. Was it hot to the south? Yeah, it was, but it was unusually cold where I. And they don't report that. All they report is a heat wave in Greece or Italy or France, and they don't report the terribly cold temperatures that I experienced. But just before I arrived, the people of the Netherlands, the greatest vote winner was Geert Wilders, and the leader of a right wing, they said, group that would, but they were staunchly opposed to the climate policies, where they were going to cull huge percentages of the Dutch herds, taking over farms by force from farmers that didn't want to give up their livelihood. Uh, they
okay.
went on you've seen the tractor protests in
Yeah.
France and the Netherlands, and this went on for weeks. And they voted the bad guys out. They voted down this radical green agenda that they're promoting, and they've gone back. And so the Netherlands is the second largest agricultural source behind the United States.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
It's just
Astonishing.
incredible uh, what they were trying to do, and thankfully the Dutch people rose up and voted them out.
Good. Well, I'm pleased to hear that. I didn't know. I knew that he got in, but I mean, tell me about this thing about food and the control of food. And there's a big, huge push, which seems to be coming from people like the head of Microsoft, as used to be Bill Gates and WHO, about not eating meat, reducing our meat consumption. What's the idea behind that? How does that fit into climate change?
Well, the claim there for meat is that bovines and other livestock uh, burp up and release methane in other areas from the front and the rear. And methane is a greenhouse gas, potent greenhouse gas. But we've got a paper. If you go to the CO2 Coalition website, you can download the paper called Methane and Climate by Dr. Richard Lindzen, and we document just how incredibly small the warming potential is of methane. And not only that, CO2 is increasing at 300 times the rate as methane.
Yeah.
So anything they try to do to forestall methane, climate change, warming, it's again on thousandths of a degree Celsius
But
of
it seems
warming.
to me that the only way that you can affect that, and they're not very explicit about this as far as I'm concerned, but the only way to affect that is to slaughter all the cows. That's
That
what
was
they
the
must mean,
plan.
isn't it? To kill
Yep.
off all of the cows. And that's why you have to come off meat, because we have to get rid of the cows. And well, I presume that applies to most animals like that. But that doesn't seem a lot of sense. And therefore, there's a push now to eat insects, I understand. Or there's insects are coming onto the agenda a lot in terms of you should have insects as part of your food and turned into burgers. I believe powdered insects can now be added to flour in the EU up to a certain percentage. The legislation allows this now to supplement it without declaring it on the packet. It's quite astonishing.
Yeah, that's not good. The reality is we haven't known it. My oatmeal that I ate this morning probably had some contaminants with, well, I would call them contaminants of insects. But this is, it's a crazy, crazy scheme that they're trying to do. No, thank you. And again, well, if you look at it, actually one of the biggest sources of methane are termites, emitting methane producing termites around the world. What are we going to do? Stop termites? No. We should. It's a crazy scheme, but I think they're overreaching and trying to impose these crazy uh, climate fixes, like eating bugs and killing cattle.
Yes, and moving us all off cars onto electric vehicles, which doesn't seem to me to solve the problem they claim exists, as it just pushes it further down the line. Because they are generating, instead of burning up gasoline, they're putting that onto power stations. Power stations burn gases and such like. They have to, in other words. Coming to the end, Gregory, and in many ways coming back to the start of your book, you mentioned that you dedicate your book at the start to your grandchildren, and you add this, that it's in the hope that they will grow up in a rational world. And that struck me quite forcefully. Are we ever going to get back to a time of rationality, back to a time of science where evidence was weighed dispassionately, where things were looked at without a preconceived notion or a crowd following idea, and that everything else was squashed and suppressed? Will we ever get back to that, do you think, looking forward?
I think you and I would certainly are pushing for that. We're doing what we can here at the CO2 Coalition to reinstate the scientific method and critical thinking skills here in America. We've launched our education initiative, which is, you could find that at co2learningcenter.com, CO2 Learning Center. We've created children's books, comics that teach science without the alarm. We teach about photosynthesis, the truth about carbon dioxide, the scientific method, various things. And we have lesson plans that go along that we've written.
Well, that
And
would be
these are
very useful.
scientists. And these are scientists. The lesson plans are written by Dr. Sharon Camp, PhD in analytic chemistry, AP science teacher. So these are scientific lesson plans that people can use. In America, we have a huge homeschool movement where all of my grandchildren are being homeschooled, and my 6-year-old granddaughter's reading, it will be a fourth grade level.
Yeah.
And these homeschools usually greatly outperform those from the public school system.
Yeah. I think that one of the most worrying things I've found about all this climate alarmism is the effect that it has on children. And there are many reports, particularly over in this country, that a proportion of young people, teenagers, believe that the world is going to end due to climate change before they grow up to be adults, and they're kind of
It,
taught that kind of thing, which I think is scandalous.
it is. But you know, Philip, that we have a new book series in this education. I call it the Sleep Well series. And we're taking animating and humanizing various animals. For example, the first book is called Chloe the Clownfish Sleeps Well at Night. It's about a clownfish who learned at school that her reef on the Great Barrier Reef was going to be destroyed. They were in great danger. And so we use that as a method to show what's the truth about coral bleaching, what's the truth about the Great Barrier Reef. So I co-authored that with Dr. Peter Ridd, um,
Oh yeah,
who
he's
was
Australia, isn't he? And great, yeah, the
yes,
great relief.
he's one of the top experts on the Great Barrier Reef. And so we're providing that information. For example, he just published information for 2023 showing that the Great Barrier Reef was at an all-time high for coral coverage across the Great Barrier Reef. Since they started in the 1980s doing these surveys, it's just completely contrary to what we're being told. And so we're going to use that as a method to entertainingly show what's the truth. And so we're doing one on polar bears and others. So we can use those methods to hopefully get through to the children. They're um,
One advantage that you have over in the States that we don't have over here in the UK is that you have a First Amendment, which allows you to publicly state what your beliefs are and what your truths are without let or hindrance. At least that's the idea behind it. And I noticed that in your book here, in the beginning, there was a very nice billboard which you put together, and
yes.
it basically said, "Sleep well. There is no climate crisis. Learn more at CO2 Coalition.org." I thought to myself, that will work fine in Pennsylvania Turnpike, but I wonder if we would even be allowed to have an advert like that in this day and age in the UK, because we don't have this First Amendment that you have. And I
Why?
wouldn't be
Why?
surprised if that
What?
was put down as misinformation or disinformation and disallowed by the advertising authority.
Well, why don't we find out? Why don't we find out? I'm willing to take the risk and try to do that. So maybe that's a great idea. I know our
Maybe
friends in
do
the
that a good one.
Netherlands are looking at something like that.
My very last question this time. I did have the good fortune of being able to speak to Will Happer and also to Richard Lindzen in different interviews. And I asked Richard Lindzen, when will climate alarmism ever end? And his answer was really, I suppose, pessimistic in a way. He said that only when the damage caused by the pursuit of carbon zero, which he believes will kill millions of people ultimately, and reduce to poverty levels in places like Africa and maintain them in abject poverty by not allowing the construction of power stations. Only when the damage becomes so great will people begin to realize that the argument itself is false and they've been misled. Do you have an equally pessimistic view of when climate alarmism will end, or do you have a more positive view of it?
I think he's right. It will hasten the cost when people finally can't afford their electricity, and they're to that point right now in the United States, Europe. We see it happening in the UK with huge increases of electricity when that hurts them in their pocketbook. And I think too they're overreaching. They're blaming everything that's somewhat unusual on
Well,
climate change.
we have a new government in this country, the Labour government, who have promised that they're going to switch everything over to solar power and wind power, and it will mean a saving of something like £300 for every single person in the country. It'll be much, much cheaper energy.
Yeah, well, of course, what they don't tell you is that energy is probably going to be highly subsidized with your tax dollars. So, so maybe they can keep the costs down, but it's going to be paid for in the back end and the front end because there's just no way that the wind and solar industries can compete cost-wise with coal or natural gas.
No. Okay. Gregory Wrightstone, thank you ever so much for your time. The book which is out is called A Very Convenient Warming. It's got a foreword by Dr. William Happer, and it's available. I got mine on Amazon at a very reasonable price. It's about £10, I think it was, in the UK. I don't know what it is in the States, and it's a book which is full of information. It's full of charts, diagrams on every single page, packed with details which you can indeed check for yourself and find out whether these things be true. So thank you very much again for your time.
Thank you.